Thank you. Thank you all very much. Can you hear me? That's obviously one of the most important aspects of this arrangement. Good. Very, very glad to hear it. I'm going to make a few preliminary remarks, which are these. When I say fair youth, I mean Southampton, the Earl of Southampton. When I say the poet of the sonnets, I mean the Earl of Oxford. Apologies to anyone in this room who might differ from that, but it's important you understand where I'm coming from, and I don't think it's any point wasting time to explain to you all why I take those views. You've all looked at the evidence yourselves, but that's what I mean when I'm talking about them. The other thing I'd like to say is that what I'm presenting today are really draft thoughts, if you like, of some of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years. They're there for you to throw buns at and rotten tomatoes. I am completely aware that some of the areas I'm going to venture in are areas where every single person in this room already has their own idea, their own personal theory. I'm aware of that, and all I ask is that you keep as open a mind as you're able to do while I'm going through areas that you think you've already sorted out. That's all I'll say, otherwise I'm going to get on with it. What I've got up here as my sort of title page, that's an impressa, and it comes from Peacham's Minerva Britannia. I'm sure you all know it because it's famous for having the famous cover with the hand coming, the secret writer coming from behind the thing, and as Oxfordians are fully aware, with the mind I shall be seen, and we have a very funny little anagram there of tibi nom de Vere. That's the front page. This is the impressa for the Earl of Southampton. Interestingly, it shows 3 girondes there, which are each in another joined. I'm not going to tell you why I've chosen that as a front piece for my talk. I think it'll become very obvious as the talk goes on, but I'd like you just to stare at that for a brief second, get the impression in your heads. It's not a form of hypnotizing you, but I think it might be useful if you're looking along those lines and thinking along those lines. Right, I'm here to talk about the Shakespeare scandal. In his sonnets, Shakespeare, speaking in the first person, reveals that his reputation and social standing are in tatters, that his name has received a brand in sonnet 111, he is despised in sonnet 37, shamed in 72, and vile esteemed 121. He's in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, has made himself a motley to the view. He feels all alone and beweeps his outcast state. He suffers a bewailed guilt because of a vulgar scandal stamped upon his brow. His name is so tainted that he believes it should be erased from the record. He says, if you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it. In me each part will be forgotten. My name be buried where my body is, and live no more to shame nor me nor you. After my death, forget me quite. No longer mourn me when I am dead. Do not so much as my poor name rehearse. I once gone, to all the world must die. Now, unless you're Shapiro or someone with a very funny head, you accept, however opaque and difficult the sonnets are, that there are allusions in there that connect to something real. We know that the fair youth is in some way mixed up in this scandal. He suffers shame, repents his ill deeds. He is blamed and slandered by people passing lascivious comments on his wantonness. The poet says he and the fair youth should not be seen together. The sonnets, as we all know, do not reveal what the nature of this scandal is. But clearly it's very important and it matters a lot to the poet. Now, 2 phrases that I've read out to you stick in my mind. I've made myself a motley to the view and a disgrace in men's eyes. If we stop to think about it for a moment and ask ourselves the question, whose men's eyes have you made yourself a mockery to the view in and a disgrace in? The answer to that is actually surprisingly easy. If you take a very simple and very uncontroversial sentence, a simple fact, you say in 1593 and 1594, William Shakespeare, whoever he was, had printed 2 poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, that were dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. By the way, that's probably the least controversial sentence I'm going to say in this whole talk, so relish it. Anyway, what does that sentence tell us? It's a platitudinous sentence, but it tells us, I think, something important. It tells us that William Shakespeare, whoever he was known to the court, because Southampton was, though very young, was a key fellow in the court. It also means that Shakespeare was known in literary circles. It seemed to me quite inconceivable that William Shakespeare could go on and on saying, I'm in this most appalling scandal, I made a terrible fool of myself, I'm a disgrace and a shame, and I can't be seen with you, fair youth. And there be no record whatsoever of that in either court circles or literary circles of the 1590s, which is when most of us agree, the sonnets were written. So it occurred to me that it would be a sensible and refreshing exercise to look for any evidence of such a scandal. First of all, I would just like to clarify, I think all of us here, or most of us, we have a very, very brave member who I love and adore and admire, called Hank. But most of us are quite scared to draw huge tranches of biographical material out of the sonnets. They are very opaque, they're open to an enormous amount of alternative interpretation, and there are clearly very high risks involved in doing that. So I thought what I would do is just take 3 points from the sonnets, which I believe are incontroversial. By the way, if I just clarify what I just said, of course I think there are wonderful little things that help the Oxfordian case a lot. When the poet says, for instance, that he's lame, and we happen to know that Oxford was lame, then obviously that's a very good thing to bring up. When the poet says, were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, and there happens to be one person in the whole of England who's uniquely responsible for the bearing of the canopy, and every year is responsible for the canopy bearers and bringing them into the Palace of Westminster at the state opening of Parliament, and that one person happens to be the Lord High Chamberlain of England, who happens to be Oxford, then that's obviously very helpful and useful. What I'm talking about is let's be cautious when we develop whole sort of biographical narratives out of the sonnets. I hope, probably after I'm dead, or probably after we're all dead, it may have been achieved, and I do admire people such as Hank who have the bravery and tenacity to do it, although I don't agree with everything he's come up with. So enough of the words of caution. Let's see what we can pluck from the sonnets that is absolutely not controversial, and see if we can work with that. Right, I've got 3 points that I believe are not controversial at all. 1, older poet tries to persuade beautiful younger man to procreate. I think we all agree with that. Now, I know that a lot of Oxfordians are wedded to the idea that what Oxford's doing is trying to get his son to marry Elizabeth Vere. I'm going to veer away from that very slightly, but let's just stick to what we've actually got. Poet persuades younger, beautiful poet to procreate, number 1. Number 2, a beautiful younger man, a fair youth, is involved with the older poet's mistress. They seem to be sharing a mistress. I say they seem to be. They are. I haven't yet heard anyone argue against that. 3 is what I've just said, that there's a big scandal going on, and both the fair youth and the poet are involved in that scandal. I think those 3 are sufficiently uncontroversial that we can try and work with them. Now, one thing that I don't think, to me, has been really very well addressed in this is if you take those 3 facts, what we seem to be thinking, the way general thought at the moment goes, is that those first 17 sonnets which are urging procreation are in some way divorced from the rest of the narrative of the sonnets. If we've agreed they're sharing a mistress, we've agreed there's a scandal, can we just for a second suppose something? I'm not saying it's right, but let's just for a second suppose it. That just walk away for a second that he's trying to get his daughter married, because in fact there are problems with that. He doesn't actually mention marriage, he's talking about procreation, and he doesn't actually mention a particular daughter or any particular person. In fact, he describes the woman or the potential mother, as a vial, V-I-A-L, almost like a sort of test tube into which some sperm can be jetted, and out of which could come a baby. So let's just for a second assume that those 3 points that I said are incontrovertible are actually linked. Now, if they're linked, that would mean that the fair youth is being persuaded to have a baby, to procreate with the mistress who they're sharing. Okay? Might sound silly, but let's now think about that, because if it's at all right, it would imply that the child of the mistress is Southampton's son. Now, in 2005, John Hamill wrote what I think is an extremely important and very good and interesting article, in which he said that the 18th Earl of Oxford was the son of Southampton. He produced in his article, as evidence for this, these 2 images. Certainly the one on the right will be familiar to, I think, all of you. It is quite extraordinary and quite unique. What you've got there is, it's called the 2 Noble Henrys, and the man on the front horse is Southampton. The one on the front horse is 18th Earl of Oxford, Henry Vere, and the one on the back is Southampton. They're a generation apart in age. I can't for the life of me anyway, I mean the official excuse for this is they're 2 commanders in the field. But nowhere else in the history of pictures have I ever found 2 commanders in the field, coyly calling themselves 2 Noble Henrys, one facing the other in that sentimental way. And in fact, if you look at them, they're looking a tiny bit similar. I think it's a possibility that whoever made this picture was deliberately letting the cat out of the bag. The picture here on the left, that was John Hamill made this up. What I say made it up, he put the 2 pictures together. The reason he did it in his article was ostensibly to show the physical similarity between the 2 men and make his case that one was the father of the other. You'll see on the right Southampton, on the left the 18th Earl of Oxford. And I think everybody will agree they do look very similar. However, I think that John missed a trick here, because in real life I don't think they did look quite so similar. First of all, let me just show Southampton and the Earl of Oxford. Now, what's interesting about this is the Earl of Southampton is this one here, obviously you'll recognise him, and the date of that picture is 1617. The one of the Earl of Oxford is 1622, so it's 5 years afterwards. I would like to draw your attention, please, to the forehead on both of these pictures, the hair on the left-hand side here, the earring, and also this patterning down here. If you can see at the bottom, you see this funny pattern, which is identical on both the pictures. This is the picture I'm showing you of Henry, the 18th Earl of Oxford there, is the original from which the first picture which I showed you, which John Hamill had, was copied. It's a print by Robert Vaughan, put out by Compton Holland. It's very rare. It's turned up in a few auction houses, and it's always described as extremely rare. Now, one of the reasons I think it's very rare is because actually it is slanderous. What's actually happened here is a picture of the young Southampton has been put on the head of a torso purporting to be the Earl of Oxford. If you look, you will also see on the other side, not on the Southampton picture, but you'll see a lovelock. Now, here, side by side, are 2 pictures, one of Southampton, one of the 18th Earl of Oxford, the one we've been talking about, and the other of the 18th Earl of Oxford. What's obviously interesting is they both look completely different. I can't see any similarity whatsoever. And they both date with absolute certainty from 1622, 1623. So what you should be looking at is the same man in both pictures. Now, I'll just return you to the picture of the 18th Earl of Oxford there, and draw attention to a couple of points. I've mentioned the lovelock. We're quite often told that a lovelock is a very common item of fashion. I did a lot of research to try and find as many pictures of men with lovelocks as I could find. I found 4 portraits of Southampton in his youth with a lovelock, and otherwise found them very hard to find indeed. And it seems quite clear to me that Southampton was actually famous for having a lovelock. I would also like to draw your attention, if you can see it, to what appears to be a rather downy cheek here. Now, the 18th Earl of Oxford in 1622 was 30 years old. If you look at this downy cheek and compare it to what was said about the young Southampton in the early 1590s, we have, for instance, Philip Stringer in 1592. No youth there present was more beautiful or more brilliant in the learned arts than this young prince of Hampshire, though his face was yet scarcely adorned by a tender down. There is a reference to Southampton that has been grossly overlooked. I urge you after this speech all to rush and find it. It's very interesting indeed. It comes from something called the Treatise of Patience and Tribulation, just after Southampton's died. And one of the things it says is, I'm now going to tell you, says the poet, apropos of Southampton, I'm now going to reveal some of the praises of your youth. Then he says, actually, I don't think I will do that, and gets a bit coy, and then he goes ahead and does exactly that. And he gives us allusions not only to the Shakespeare sonnet, but also to Venus and Adonis. Well, most of us knew that he's the faves in the sonnets of Venus and Adonis anyway, and also to some works of Barnfield, so we can show that those were the praises of his youth. Anyway, among those, he says, sweet youth, what made thee hide thine amorous face, and cheeks scarce downy in a steely case? There's the downy things again. You'll also remember in The Lover's Complaint, that fellow who tells lies to a father and a daughter, a small show of man was yet upon his chin, we are told in that one, began but to appear like unshorn velvet. We also hear, and I know a lot of you are very wedded to the idea that Oxford is Bertram. My own view is that that was an early play, and I'm sure Oxford was Bertram, but I think it was rejigged at some point. All's well that ends what I'm talking about. And certainly Ackrigg, who wrote the big biography of Southampton, identifies Southampton as Bertram, and there again he has a goodly patch of velvet on his face, and Venus and Adonis famously, a tender spring upon thy tempting lip shows the unripe. And Pandarus says of the beautiful Troilus, and we'll come back to this, you know he has not passed 3 or 4 hairs on his chin. I'm getting the impression that Southampton was not only famous for his lovelock, he was also famous in his youth for this so-called rather attractive down. So if I go to the next picture here, you see the full picture by Robert Vaughan, this rare print I'm talking about. You see at the top the Oxford coat of arms. Robert Vaughan, I should tell you, was a very, very knowledgeable engraver, knowledgeable on the matter of coats of arms. Now, if you look at the baton that Southampton is holding, you'll see that he's holding it right across his breastplate there. Now, if you know about arms, you will know that to have a baton that goes from the bottom left up to the top right, it's called a baton sinister, and it is an identification of bastardy. In fact, to this day, you get the Dukes of St Albans, the Dukes of Grafton, for instance, they're bastard sons of bastard offspring from the Charles II, and on their coats of arms they have a baton sinister. This is well known to anybody who knows about heraldry, and Vaughan certainly did. If I show you very closely, and I'm afraid those at the back, it's almost impossible that you'll be able to see it, but maybe some at the front. Just above, if I go to, can you see it? There, right there. There's a star going across the breastplate with the baton sinister going across it. This is essentially telling you that he is a bastard of the House of Oxford. Now, let us just suppose, looking at that evidence for a second then, that we're on to something. Actually, I have to tell you something quite extraordinary, because before I came on and gave this talk this morning, I bumped into Lynn Morris, who's probably here somewhere, and she didn't know what I was going to talk about. She didn't know that I was going to be saying about this issue of the 18th Earl of Oxford being Southampton's. She said, you'll never guess, she said, I found 2 references in Hall's Virginiarium, however you pronounce it, showing that the 18th Earl of Oxford is a bastard. She didn't know I was going to say that. I don't know those references, so I long to get back in touch with her after this and find them. So what I'd like to do now is let's just bear with this idea that the 18th Earl of Oxford is Southampton's, and let's go back briefly to the sonnets and see if they can help us there. Right, now you all know this. It's so famous it hardly needs mentioning. I just want to draw attention to the first phrase here. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets. Now, as we all know, the arguments that have gone on for hundreds of years over the meaning of the word begetter. Is the begetter the person who brought the sonnets to the publisher, TT? Is the begetter the person who inspired the sonnets? Or is the begetter the person who wrote the sonnets? I think what seems to be going on in this great debate is A, we're forgetting the principal meaning of the word to beget, which is to father. And one of the reasons we're forgetting the principal meaning of the word to beget being a father is because he's talking about the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets. So we're treating it a bit like a transitive verb. Whatever begetting is going on here, it's happening to the sonnets. So if we accept the word begetting meaning to father, then he can only be the author. He's begetting the sonnets. And that doesn't make sense, because why would TT be dedicating these things to the author, Mr. W.H.? Because we all don't, I mean, whether you're Oxfordian or whatever you are, you don't think that Mr. W.H. wrote the sonnets. So then people move off and do something else. However, can I please draw your attention to some very obvious phrases and things, the sort of things we say all the time, such as the villain of the piece, the hero of the film. What I think this is dedicating to is the begetter of the sonnets, means the person in the sonnets, the character in the sonnets, who does some begetting. I don't think that's a very far-fetched thing to suggest, because, as we all know, you turn the page and you get 17 sonnets in a row saying, will you beget, 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 a boy for love of me 17 times. What's very interesting when you read those 17 sonnets in sequence is they all tend to use the same argument. If you don't have a boy for love of me, if you don't beget, your beauty will die. If you could somehow create a sort of barroom joke out of this, I would suggest something like, how do you get a narcissist to do what you want? You tell him his beauty will die if he doesn't. And we know that Southampton was a narcissist. In fact, he's accused of narcissism in the sonnets. There's a very witty Latin poem with lots of echoes and things in it about Narcissus, which is dedicated to him. The dedication is undersigned Clapham. John Clapham was a dry as dust stick old secretary of Burleigh's, and typically the Orthodox say that's who wrote it, but it's quite obviously Oxford. But so you carry on, and there are a number of references to Southampton as a narcissist. Now, what's interesting here is if the simple argument is your beauty will go if you don't procreate, what was the point in writing that 17 times in 17 sonnets? In fact, Shakespeare is so concise that he makes the point totally clearly in the first two lines of the very first sonnet. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. Said it. Can we go on to another subject? No. 17 sonnets. Have a baby, have a baby, have a baby. Why does he do it 17 times? Now, those of you who are familiar with the biography of the Earl of Oxford will know perfectly well that the Earl of Oxford was extremely keen to have an heir. I did quote him, I would find it, he famously wrote to Burleigh in 1575, I thank God that it hath pleased him, that's God, to make me a father, and if it is a boy, I shall likewise be the partaker in a greater contentation. I don't think it's sexist or anything to say that the Earl of Oxford quite naturally, very, very much craved an heir to what was the most distinguished and longest running earldom in England, and a cause of his great pride and interest. It's very clear from that 1575. We're now jumping forward 18 years, and he still doesn't have an heir. So what I'm suggesting, quite obviously here, is that he is persuading Southampton to surrogate an heir for him to become the 18th Earl of Oxford. Now, if I'm right, and I'm not saying I am, but if I'm onto anything at all, and that heir was born, and that heir eventually became the 18th Earl of Oxford, even when it was a baby, it was likely to become the 18th Earl of Oxford, and the sonneteer wished to make that point, where do you suppose he would make it? He's had 17 shots at saying, your beauty will die if you don't have an heir for love of me. If I were him, and he had a baby suddenly, I'd plop it into the 18th sonnet, because the numerical symbolism is obviously sitting there to be had. Right, now, let me just remind you that the 17th sonnet says, thou diest unless thou get a son, and one particular sentence of great interest, I think, the poet says, winter's ragged hand shall deface in thee thy summer. In other words, your summer will come to a pathetic fast end if you don't have a baby. What does the 18th sonnet say? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? No, I shan't, because summer's lease hath all too short a date. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. We've just been told 17 times that you're not going to have an eternal summer unless you have a baby. And suddenly on the 18th sonnet, we're told his summer's eternal. It seems very likely to me now at this point already that the 18th, the next or potential 18th Earl of Oxford has been born. Just lastly, before I move away from the sonnet, I would just like to return you to that opening phrase there and point out, and maybe it might be a complete and utter irrelevance, but it's there for the picking or rejecting if you want, that you only need to remove 4 letters from that opening phrase to get the message to the only begetter of the ensuing son, Mr. W.H. So, let's move away from the sonnets, because I know they're a hotbed of contention, and I'm sure Hank has already fallen off his chair by now. And do what this talk is really proposing to do. As I said, if there's such a big disgrace, he's known to courtiers and he's known to the literary circles. So let's look at the literary allusions to Shakespeare and see if we can find any hint in them whatsoever that this sort of rigmarole has gone on. Right, so let's go to the first, and that's what I'm going to do today, okay? So it's the literary allusions I'm going through, not the historical ones. So bear that in mind before you get cross that there's not enough historical information here. Okay, this, as we all know, is the first ever place where Shakespeare is mentioned. It's called Willoughby His Visa. Those who don't know about it, it's an extremely scurrilous, long poem which retells the story of Penelope, the ancient Greek myth, where Penelope is abandoned by her husband Ulysses for 20 years and spends those 20 years fending off suitors who come one by one to get into bed with her. This has one extraordinary coincidence with the sonnets that I'm sure everybody in this room is totally aware of. The poem is laid out as 4 successive suitors, one after another with different names, and they're coded. When everybody got uppity about this, the book was eventually banned in 1599, but it went into several editions. And someone got pretty uppity about it straight away and produced a refutation called Penelope's Complaint, in which they said, please don't assume that anyone here is a real people, but they quite obviously are. So you've got the 4 suitors, and then we get to the last third of the book, where you have a young fellow, rather narcissistic fellow, called H.W. Is that a coincidence? Same as Henry Wriothesley, who is advised by a slightly older person who is simply given the initials W.S. Is that a coincidence? William Shakespeare. Now, the older person spends a lot of time advising the younger person on how to get off with a visa. Now, what's very extraordinary about this, if you read it carefully, is you'll find that in advising H.W. on how to get off with a visa, he alludes to certain poems that are familiar to us. One of those poems appears under the name of William Shakespeare in something called The Passionate Pilgrim. So that helps us perhaps to confirm our idea that W.S. is indeed an allusion to William Shakespeare. Another allusion with which he tries to persuade H.W. how to get off with this woman comes from a famous poem by Oxford about the trickling tears, the secret sighs that show my inward grief. In fact, W.S. advises H.W., your silent sighs and trickling tears let her in secret often see. And I won't go through it now for time's limited, but you'll find allusion after allusion to Oxford's, that one Oxford poem with the Shakespeare poem. So here we have Oxford and W.S. together. Can we learn any more about this W.S. figure? The answer is yes, you can, and it's actually quite easy, but I'm quite amazed that nobody has yet done this. Or maybe they have, so I'm not trying to bag the glory about this, but it just seemed very obvious when I did it. If you go through the advice that W.S. gives to H.W., W.S. says, I've already tried to get off with this woman. What do you mean that he has got off with her? But everything's double-speak in this. I've already tried it. I've tried the like courtesy, he says. And that means to me that that W.S., whoever he is, must be one of those 4 early suitors. So he advises, W.S. advises H.W. To apply a visa with diverse things, sometimes with gold, sometimes with rings. We're also told that W.S. took pleasure for a time to see H.W. bleed. Now, if you search through the suitors to find anyone who matches that, we come up with one who calls himself D.B. D.B., you might say, does sound a little bit, maybe exaggerating and showing off, but it sounds a little bit like De Vere. He's described as a Frenchman. De Vere is a French name. And D.B., when he's trying to get off with that visa, he keeps up a continued course of courtesy with jewels, rings, gold, and diverse gifts, exactly what he advised H.W. to do. Furthermore, he can smile while others smart, which is exactly what he's doing as W.S. So very quickly, you can home in on D.B., who is quite obviously De Vere. I say he's quite obviously De Vere, because not only does he quote or give a very strong allusions to Shakespeare, he talks about the labours lost, he's addressed as mighty lord by Avisa, he's very generous, as we know De Vere was. He uses as a little sign for himself DB, sorry, DB is what he calls his cognizance, if you like, or his motto, is Deudum Beatus, which means until lately well off. So he's someone who recently was very rich, like De Vere. And again, we find a particular poem that will be well known to all of you who know De Vere's poems, which is heavily alluded to drawing that scene. Okay? So again, this comes out at the time we're talking about the sonnets, so we do seem to have a really good connection there between Henry Wriothesley, De Vere, Shakespeare in Willoughby Has Avisa. This leaves obviously a big question open about who is Avisa, because if we're really onto the right track, this is exciting, because if we can get the right person, we've got that ever elusive dark lady in the bag, possibly. Now, John Hamill, in his article of 10 years ago, was absolutely correct and had exactly the right nose. He realized that to get to the bottom of this, you had to establish who Avisa is. And there have been quite a lot of theories. John was impressed by an article, I don't remember exactly when it was written, that said she was Elizabeth Trentham. And so he followed with that and created a narrative out of this that Southampton was somehow playing around with Oxford's wife, and thus the baby was born. I reject Elizabeth Trentham for a number of reasons. Not least, we're told that in Avisa that she's been married 10 years, and of course Elizabeth Trentham was married nothing like that. But I also came across this poem, which I think was unknown to John at the time. It talks about Oxford. God grant to the Earl of Oxford, mirror of highness, happiness in this world. God bless his lady, the Countess Elizabeth Trentham, that right, true, maiden of honour, immaculate virgin. Please look at the date on this, it's 1600. Now, if she's an immaculate virgin in 1600, How do we account for having a 7-year-old son who is called Henry Bulbeck? Called Henry, very important point. Immaculate Virgin, for those of you who are up in theology, means one thing, and it means one thing only. It means a mother who has not had sexual intercourse. And to call Elizabeth Trentham that, I'm afraid, is one of many, many reasons that I've had to reject John's otherwise brilliant article and reject his identification of Avisa. Now, Avisa is quite obviously someone in court. She's quite obviously something of a slut. And that's what we're all giggling about, and that's why it had to be banned. Now, this is where I'm going to irritate you all, but I've got a lot to say, and a lot of it's a hell of a lot more interesting than what I've said already. So I'm simply going to cheat you, I'm afraid, on this, and I'm going to tell you that Avisa is Penelope Rich. Penelope Rich was the sister of the Earl of Essex. She was identified as early as 1888 by someone, Massey, as the Dark Lady of the Sonnets, but he hadn't connected her to Avisa at all. She had jet black eyes. She was known as something of a naughty woman. She had 11 known children by 2 different men, one of whom was not her husband. And she had 12, if you count a miscarriage, in 1594, and 13, if you're going to swing along with me and say that she also had Henry, 18th Earl of Oxford. Interestingly enough, those 13 pregnancies, 13 children can be mapped out very well, and they all happen boing, 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 really pretty regularly, apart from a 2-year gap where she suddenly appears to have no one, into which I'm plopping the 18th Earl of Oxford, who was born on, I think, the 23rd of February, 1593. Why I said I was going to annoy you about Penelope Rich, not because I think any of you are so close to the idea that Penelope Rich could possibly be Avisa. Why I said I'm going to annoy you is because I'm just not going to go through all the countless reasons why she's Avisa. I've told you that the thing is all based on the story of Penelope, and there are hundreds of reasons, and why I'm not going to go through them is because they're all there on the internet. There's a guy called Michael Mooton, and I really do advise anyone who hasn't read this article. He writes a very long article and absolutely nails it. He's actually the second person to talk of Avisa. Dr. Ian Wilson was the first, and all his stuff is on the internet too. It just seems to me that although it's obviously crucial to what I'm talking about, it seems such a waste of time that I come 3,500 miles to talk to you and just regurgitate a lot of stuff on the internet. But I really do advise you to read it, and it's totally and utterly sold it on me, and I cannot believe there can be any real dissent about it. Actually, in all their information, I would just like to throw this extra little bit in, which I don't think they seem to use, but I think it's very relevant. This was a poem published in 1606, the year before Penelope Rich died. If you, I'm very sorry at the back, because it's possibly illegible, but if those who can see it, you'll see capital letters at the top. P-E-N, Penelope, got that on the first letters of that. Penelope, Countess, then you have to take the S from the middle of that, capital S, of, and then we go into the second verse, following the capital letters only, Devonshire. You see it's all spread out. She became, controversially, she became Countess of Devonshire when she married her lover, who was Charles Blount. Controversially, because her husband was still married, and it wasn't clear whether she had any right to be married to Blount and call herself Countess of Devonshire. Anyway, you followed those capitals, Penelope, Countess of Devonshire, and then it looks as if it comes to an end there. However, if you follow the capitals still further down into the bottom, you will find C, O on the next line, I somewhere down at that second line, T, U, I, Coi Tui, which, to put it very blankly or frankly in Latin, means for a fuck. In other words, you go to her if you want to have it off. So she had a very bad reputation, and she died in a state of great dishonor, but certainly all the court was talking about her. Another thing I'd like to say, 2 things which about her, which very slightly help you to get your heads around, because I totally accept that absolutely probably nearly everyone in this room, this is a totally new concept that Penelope Rich is Dark Lady, but just a couple of things that help to push you in that direction if that's where you wish to be pushed. Please resist if you don't. One is her association with the colour black. James I called her fair woman with a black soul. She famously had jet black eyes. I don't know if I pointed it out to you, but when I showed you the picture of Henry VIII there, it was very striking, had jet black eyes. Black was her favourite colour. She was rather obsessed with it, actually, and her room in Essex House had a black counterpane and black carpet and black chairs, and we have quite a detail of all the black she had in that room. If you go onto the internet and look her up on Wikipedia, don't bother to read it, it's totally rubbish, but you will see a nice picture of her there, wearing the most beautiful black robe. Also, and you'll realise instantly why this is relevant, she is the most strongest candidate of anybody at court to be identified as Venus. She was, of course, as we know, Philip Sidney's Stella, and Sidney associates her a number of times with Venus. He talks of her wearing Venus badge in every part of thee. Spencer compares her to fairest Venus, as does Henry Locke in Ecclesiastes of 1597. She's compared to Venus also in Britain's Bower of Delights in 1591, and by Brisket in his Morning Muse of Thestilis. Alexander Craig calls her Venus in his Amorose of 1606, and she's called this lovely Venus in the front matter of Sylvester's translation of Du Bartas. Interesting enough, Penelope Rich was actually also alluded to this as Venus in the title and in the content of a 1591 pamphlet called Philip's Venus, obviously referring to Philip Sidney's Venus. And not only that, she was obviously going along with this sport to some degree, because in 1604 she actually played the part of Venus in Daniel's Masque, The Vision of the 12 Goddesses. In a beauty contest, in the victory of English chastity under the feigned name of Avisa, this is 1596, a sort of quasi answer to Willoughby, his of Venus, Avisa, Penelope is represented as Venus. Okay, now what I'd like to do then is try to be quick about this and go through some of the Shakespeare allusions and see if we can find any hint there, any smell of this idea that I'm putting forward to you, which in a nutshell we can now summarise. The Earl of Oxford wanted an heir, he got young Southampton and Penelope Rich to surrogate the heir for him to become the 18th Earl of Oxford. Let's just see, well, let's look at, so in order then. Thomas Edwards, a very, very early allusion to Shakespeare. It occurs in something called the Envoy to Narcissus. An envoy, of course, is a sort of tag that you stick to the end of a poem, and at our peril do we decide, as most Stratfordians do, that envoys have absolutely nothing to do with the main content of the poem. They always have something to do with the content of the poem. We should all make an effort to find out what that connection is. This poem is called Narcissus, so perhaps you can already guess what this poem might be about, and why Shakespeare's name crops up in the Envoy to Narcissus. Right. What it seems to be doing, if we just take its surface meaning, is going through praise of various poets. So he talks about Colin, the Spencer, etc., etc. And then he says, deal we not with Rosamond. He always puts these little names of poets, he names them by naming their works rather than their actual names. So deal is someone called R.L. who wrote a set of sonnets called Diella Sonnets, that weren't published until 1596. Deal we not with Rosamond. Rosamond's obviously Samuel Daniel, who wrote the Complaint of Rosamond. For the world our soul will coat. I know what that means, but I think at this early stage, if I tell you, you'll think I'm talking rubbish and disbelieve the rest of my talk. So I'll carry on. Amintus and Leander's Gone, obviously references to Thomas Watson, who wrote Amintus, and Leander's Gone is Christopher Marlowe. Anyway, we get to the next verse. By the way, I've cut here into the middle of the envoy. We go to the next verse. Adon, deftly masking through. I found no one on any side of the authorship debate or anyone who disputes that this reference to Adon is Shakespeare, so let's all go with it. Deftly masking through is deeply painful to the Stratfordians because masking isn't terribly good if you're trying to say someone who's just written Venus and Adonis and the name William Shakespeare all over it. If you're trying to say he's using a mask, doesn't seem to fit. And deafly, if you look it up in OED, can mean silent. So we're being told that Adon, unseen and unheard, sinks to me of someone using a pseudonym. Stately troops, rich, conceited. Well, should we just be blithe about these things? Should we ignore that word rich? Should we ignore the fact that the stately troops, rich, conceited, can easily mean that you're writing tropes, which are verses which are thematically full of references to someone called Rich? Should we just ignore that? Yes. Let's also ignore, because I know it makes everybody very, very tense, the fact that you could possibly get the letters of Lady Penelope Rich out of that line, because someone will cleverly jump up and say, no, you can't, you have to use the P twice. So let's completely ignore that and move on. Showed he well deserved to. I'm going to come to that line. It's extremely interesting when you know what he's banging on about. Love's delight on him to gaze. And had not, this is an important line, and had not love herself entreated, other nymphs had sent him bays. Had not love herself entreated, love herself, of course, we probably think is Venus. If you look up entreated in its old meanings, it means to intervene. Now, had not Venus intervened, other nymphs would have given him bays. You would have got some bays. Bays, of course, are the honour of a poet. You would have got some bays if Venus hadn't entreated. Coming a bit near to what I think we're talking about here. The poem goes on. Eke in purple robes disdained, furthermore, in robes of dishonour. Disdained means to be dishonoured, shamed, disgraced. He's wearing purple robes. Someone who wears purple robes is, of course, someone in high position, a nobleman, a senator in ancient Rome. So we're being told that, furthermore, there's someone rather grand who's been dishonoured. Well, I think instantly you lot are thinking, he must be talking about Henry de Vere. We know he's in a bit of trouble, and that's what we're basically talking about here. Amidst the centre of this climb, I have heard say. I think I have heard say is quite a useful sort of tush, tush, wink, wink. Yes, you know, it's a secret. Shh. That's what they might have heard say is giving away here. I have heard say, one whose power floweth far, that should have been of our rhyme the only object in a star. Well could his bewitching pen done the muse's object to us, although he deserves much from men. Although he differs much from men, tilting under friaries, yet his golden art might woo us to have honoured him bays. That's a bit of a coincidence. We've just heard that Adon might have got some bays for his wonderful poetry, had not Venus intervened. And now we're told that this rather mystical hidden fellow who's in purple robes disdained might also have got some bays, had his behaviour not been rather rum. Roger Straight Matter has written an extremely good and convincing article showing that strange allusion, tilting under friaries, alludes to the fact that Oxford got out into the middle of the street in a sort of Romeo and Juliet style, and Oxford's men had all these fights on the streets at Blackfriars with Knivett's men, and there were some fatalities, and clearly it was something that was quite big in the news. Other people, I think, have pointed out this thing about being the only object of a star. Of course, Oxford's coat of arms has as its only object, or in fact in heraldry we call it only charge, which is a star. So in quite a lot of ways we can see that Oxford is in there. And in fact, the first person to suggest Oxford was a Stratfordian, I think, called Dowden in 1890 or something like that. But obviously, Oxford's name, as we're told by Heward, is radioactive, so nobody likes to go there anymore. Now, how can we tell, apart from that interesting coincidence of both the Adon verses and the Oxford verses ending with this point about you would have got bays if, apart from that connection, how do we know that the person in purple robes disdained is the same person as Adon, i.e. is Shakespeare? That's actually not too difficult. Again, I go back to saying, please, please, when you're reading Envoys, and it's quite interesting how many Shakespeare allusions turn up in those last little bits of poems. I mean, you think of Barkstead's Mira, the Labia reference at the end of Marston's Pygmalion. They're not at the end for no reason. So please read the whole poem, which is Narcissus. If you do read the whole poem of Narcissus, you will find that Adon is in that poem, and Adon is clad in purple hair. Now, hair means haircloth. If you look it up in the dictionary, it's haircloth that penitents wear. This grand secret poet is wearing purple robes disdained. In other words, Adon Adonis, Adon, and this secret poet are wearing exactly the same clothes. That is a clue that Adon and this purple fellow, who we've seemed to have identified as De Vere, are the same person. But if you're still in any doubt about that, he actually gives you another little jolt to show you. What he says is, amidst the center of this climb. That's where we're going to find this mysterious, hidden, purple-robed, disdained poet, amidst the center of this climb. Now, obviously, the surface meaning of that is in the center of this sort of literary circle that he's just discussed. But we're beginning to realize that we need to find double meanings, especially when we're talking about a hidden poet, hush, hush, I have heard say. By the way, I forgot to mention that this poet, of all the poets mentioned, is the only one who is not given a name. The rest of you have got Amyntas, Leander, Adon. This one is just not given a name. But we're getting close now to discovering that he's obviously Adon. So, amidst the center of this climb, what is the second meaning of that? If you count they love numerology, the Elizabethans. If you count the number of verses in the envoy, they come to 15. So let's go to the center of 15. That's the central verse, which is obviously verse 8. Ho, ho, lo and surprise, that's the Adon verse. Well, we've all been expecting that. But he says, amidst the center. So you go to the middle of this center verse, and there you see a rather strange line, showed he well deserved to. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to yawn and balk when I say the word anagram. So just please, those of you who hate them, hold your breaths. I'm not going to be rude about modern authorship studiers who sneer at anagrams. We're 400 years later. We don't live in the age, the cult age, as Christopher Ricks called it, of the anagram, which was the Elizabethan and Jacobean time. We don't live in that. And so I quite understand why there are certain people who balk at them. I know particularly in the authorship question, there are people who balk at them because of the great disservice and mess that Ignatius Donnelly and people did with the Baconians, creating these absolutely extravagant ciphers. But Camden, who was living at the time in the cult of the anagram, did quite naturally sneer at those who were rude about anagrams. It was very rude about them, but they were right in the middle. He called them the sour sort. So if anyone doesn't like anagrams here, rest assured I'm not accusing you of it being the sour sort, because it is 400 years later. But I would urge you to read The Art of English Poesy, which has a very good chapter on anagrams. Read what Camden has to say about anagrams. Read what Drummond of Hawthornden has to say about anagrams. Like it or not, anagrams were very important in the poetry of this period, and there are some extremely serious Stratfordian scholars, such as Christopher Ricks, who write very cleverly and intelligent about them. So I just urge you not to run away screaming and blocking your ears, but to realize that there are such things as anagrams going on. If you've just been directed to find the man in purple robes disdained amidst the center of this climb. We've done exactly that, and we've come to that line, showed he well deserved to. There you would have Edward, spelled E-W-D, using the apostrophe that they've got there, and showed apostrophe D, Edward de Vere. So he's actually in there. Sorry, the line I just talked about, showed he well deserved to. What are you looking at, you guys? Look, well, I've got lots of interesting stuff. I'm sorry. I've ballsed that up. I don't know how that happened.
You said there were 15, you went to the 8th one, so you directed us back somewhere else. And we're going to show it back.
All right, I'm really sorry. It's bloody annoying now. I don't know how that happened. It's a balls up, but it's not on there. But it should have been. But you all know the poem quite well. I'll just give you the last time that verse. I'll give it last time. Adon, deftly masking through stately troops, rich conceited, showed he well deserved to love's delight on him to gaze, and had not love herself entreated, other nymphs had sent him bays. I'm sorry, but I think we all know that text. Thank God, because this just shows even more that we need that illusion book I'm talking about, so we've all got it. But anyway, in that line, it showed he well deserved to, which gives you Edward de Vere. Interestingly enough, this thing about love intervening, the idea we won't give him bays, his morality is so bad, something to do with Venus and dirt and filth. This, I think, echoes very much a very dirty, double-meaning, double entendre epigram on Shakespeare by Bancroft. which says, "Thou hast so used thy pen," which might mean Penelope Rich, but it could mean penis. "Thou hast so used thy pen, or shook thy spear, that poet's startled, nor thy wit come near." Right, let's move on, because we're going to run out of time. Here's another, as I keep saying, there only are actually 5 references to Shakespeare by name in the 1590s, so let's try and move a bit quicker through these. This one comes from Richard Barnfield, "Remembrance of some English poets. And Shakespeare thou, whose honey-flowing vein, pleasing the world thy praises doth obtain, whose Venus and whose Lucrece, sweet and chaste, thy name in fame's immortal book hath placed. Live ever you, at least in fame live ever, well may the body die, but fame dies never." I think we all know that. We all know the, to use a Mike Ledbetter phrase, we know the Stratfordian shtick on that. Namely, oh, that's quite interesting, it shows that Shakespeare's getting famous at an early date, by 1598, and that people are reading his Venus and Lucrece. I've just shown you, it takes a little bit of time to show, I've just shown you how Henry Rothschild, Penelope Rich, and Oxford both seem to be contained in the previous one. Let's now look at this one. Is there any sign that something naughty or bad's going on? What makes this verse interesting is it's actually the last verse of 4. The other 4 verses praise other poets and the remembrance of those English poets. I won't go into the details of why, but I think there's a double meaning even in the title. We're being invited to think that the poem is "Let us remember these poets." Actually, I think what it's saying is all of these poets are remembering Penelope Rich. That's what they're actually talking about. And they come to the last one. So, "Shakespeare thou." The first thing I would note is this extra couplet. If you're observant, you'll see that he changes from "thee, thou," the sort of familiar term, into the last 2 lines to "you." And "you" is obviously used for a plural, but it is also used when you address someone of very high rank. So I think what it's doing is being very, very clever. If someone said to Barnfield, "What the hell is this?" because I smell a rat, and I'll tell you why they will smell a rat in a second, he'll say, no, all I did is I added the last couplet because I was talking to all the poets. But in fact, the 4th line is connected to that last couplet, if you look carefully. It says, "Thy name in fame's immortal book hath placed, live ever you, at least in fame live ever." You've got "in fame" twice. If you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up "in fame," you have the following definition: "Of ill fame, infamous, an infamous person, one branded with infamy." And for infamy, we're talking about evil fame or reputation, scandalous reproach, public reproach, shame or disgrace. Just so happens, another coincidence perhaps, that's precisely what Shakespeare's saying he's suffering from in the sonnets. So, now, can we identify Edward de Vere there? I know people get a little bit tired of evers and nevers, but it is very noticeable that the last 2 lines, first one ends ever and the next one ends never. And as we know, Oxford put out poems subscribed ever and never. Oxford also played about, as we know, with the fact that VER appeared at the end of the word ever and evia. He himself did it in an echo poem, so we know that it was happening at the time. And I do accept some criticism that there is a liability amongst Oxfordians to be a little bit trigger-happy. But I don't think we are being trigger-happy in this particular instance. "Live ever you, at least in fame, live ever, in fame." So "live evia," so he's just talked about Shakespeare, now he's saying "live evia, live at least in fame," as an infamous person. "Well may the body die, but fame dies never." So your reputation will live on in infamy. Now, this awful thing of bloody anagrams returns again, so block your ears if you're one of the, well, would have been one of the sour sort when Camden was writing about it. Note the 2nd line. "And Shakespeare thou, whose honey-flowing vein, pleasing the world thy praises doth obtain." It's a rather strange sentence, that. And clearly it contains something because it says "doth obtain." Now, if there's a real smart aleck in this audience, they'll know that perhaps the version of that poem they're most familiar with says praises "doth contain." Actually, there's a difference between the 1607 version. Barnfield himself edited this and put it out in 1607 again, just after Penelope Rich had died. As I'm sure you will know, he's very rude about Penelope Rich in a dedication, and he's rather obsessed with this whole problem. But on this particular talk, I'm actually going to leave Barnfield a bit out of it, apart from this. So he changed doth obtain to doth contain. So that's telling us, anyone who does crossword clues, that there's probably a little anagram in there, and I'm sure you can all tell who it is. Now, it's Henry Wriothesley, by the way. Now, just as you're all getting terribly cross about this, bloody anagram stuff, please can I show you this? I'm sorry at the back if you can't read it. What I've laid out here are 7 anagrams of the name Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. They are not mine. I did not find them and say, ooh, that looks like an anagram of Henry Wriothesley. This anagrams at the time printed, which the author at the time said, this is an anagram of Henry Wriothesley. So it's not me coming up with it, it's them. So you'll see, right, Treatise of Patience and Tribulation, 1625, Henry James Wriothesley, anagram, here I see many worthies lie. Number 2 from the same work, we have Henry Southampton, anagram, thy stamp in honour. Number 3, Henry Wriothesley, you'll note the E has been dropped out of Henry Wriothesley there, Earl of Southampton, anagram, thy honour is worth the praise of all men. Then we have another here, as above, Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, anagram, virtue is thy honour, oh, the praise of all men. I won't bother with the 5th one, it's in Latin. The 6th one is Camden, who I've just told you is very interested in anagrams and writes about them very well. Again, that's the Latin one. Let's skip to the 7th one. A funeral elegy on the much lamented death of the transpuissant and unmatchable king, 1625, by Thomas Hayward. He has Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, his anagram, thy honour is worthy all praise. Now, I don't know how many of you here are absolutely geniuses at anagrams, but if there are any among you, you would have instantly spotted that most of those anagrams don't actually work properly. In fact, if you just look at the last one, thy honour is worthy all praise. That's actually, he's got reduced 34 letters to 27. One of the Y's has been rejected, an extra L has been added, there's double E's and F, and he's messing about. Ditto, if you look at number 3, Henry Wriothesley, which he turns into, thy honour is worth the praise of men. He's dropped an E from Wriothesley, but he still has too many E's and has to deal with that by just leaving them out. So the important thing to understand before we turn into sour swords is anagrams very, very often are not perfect. And these are anagrams when they're actually saying, here is an anagram, and showing off and boasting. Now, quite often what they do is they allow a name to be plucked out of something, to be contained in there, for clever anagram hunters in the cult of anagram days to find them. I didn't mention, so I knew it'd be so cross if I kicked off the very, very first mention of William Shakespeare comes in Willoughby as a visa, and it's in the line, Shakespeare paints poor Lucrece's rape. I didn't say because I knew it'd be so cross that Penelope is obviously in there. So let's. I've given you that awful bossy lecture about anagrams. I think we can move on. Right, let's move to Weaver. Weaver's the third of 5 interesting allusions to Shakespeare. Weaver actually writes 2 allusions to Shakespeare. The first one, they're both from the 4th book of his epigrams. And the first one says, Apelles, that's the Greek painter, did paint Venus queen, that most supposed he had fair Venus seen. But thy bald rhymes of Venus savour so, that I dare swear, thou dost all Venus know. Titter, titter, titter. What is he saying? A poet is writing about Venus. This is published in 1595, so we've had 4 editions of Venus and Adonis. It's a bawdy poem, yes, we know that, so he's obviously talking about Shakespeare. And what he's saying, titter, titter, ha, ha, is that the poet seems to have had it off with the real model for Venus. I've just explained to you that Venus, it seems to be Penelope Rich. Why some of you might be looking a bit agog about this, saying, hang on, I didn't know that was an allusion to Shakespeare. The reason you didn't know it was an allusion to Shakespeare has been suppressed, and the reason it's been suppressed is because of the title. It says, in spuriam quendam scriptorum, which means to spurious, a certain writer. Spurious, of course, means not proceeding from its reputed author, in other words, a pseudonym. Now, if you want to know more about this pseudonymous author who's had it off with the real model for Venus, You want to know his double. What do? Well, you double it. That's epigram 11, so let's go to epigram 22 and see if we learn any more. Ooh, by George. Wilhelm Shakespeare, isn't that a coincidence? Okay, so we're now on the second Weaver one, which is connected to the first one, because we're also talking about a Venus poet, who is number 22, and verse number 11. Now, he kicks off, honey-tongued Shakespeare, when I saw thine issue, I swore Apollo got them and none other. Oh, he's straight away talking about bastardy and illegitimacy, and quite a funny little joke here. Their rosy tainted features, clothed in tissue, some heaven-born goddess said to be their mother. He's already making jokes straight away about Shakespeare's issue, i.e. his children, his pedigree, and about said to be their mother. So we're well in the epigrams. You have to realize about epigrams, they contain salt, they're wicked, they're naughty. Johnson called them sulphurous. Just to read an epigram, say, oh, that's a sweet little thing, he says a pretty nice thing about Shakespeare. No, they don't. And very few Stratfordians, I can think of only two, have actually pointed out that this epigram to Shakespeare is actually hostile towards Shakespeare. And if you read on through it, you'll see he carries on the joke about what his children looked like, and they look like Adonis. And as we all know, Southampton is frequently called an Adonis. And then that rather strange line about Romeo, Richard, more whose names I know not. I think what he's trying to do there is name more Shakespeare characters that are kind of based on Henry Wriothesley and things. You can't quite remember them. But anyway, I'll leave the rest. You can look through that. I want to draw attention particularly to actually the first line. Honey-tongued Shakespeare, when I saw thine issue. Now, we're always told that honey-tongued is a very polite way of saying he wrote very pretty poems. Actually, honey-tongued, it's defined by Chambers' dictionary as persuasively eloquent. The OED goes persuasive or seductive in speech. I think it's very interesting. We know that Shakespeare is described as honey-tongued, not only in Weaver. I think we've already seen a honey-tongued. He's honey-tongued in Mears, Barnfield, and Heywood, and many others. Shakespeare, when he uses honey-tongued in Richard III, Lovelace Lost, and Winter's Tale, he uses the term disparagingly of people who gloss the truth and are dangerously persuasive. If I proved honey-mouthed, says Paulina in Winter's Tale, promising to tell the truth, let my tongue blister. Shakespeare, as I said, is frequently described as this, and I think one of the most extraordinarily interesting and relevant to what I'm talking about today is Troilus and Cressida. Lord Pandarus, rather like Oxford, is described as the honey-sweet lord in Troilus and Cressida. And if you remember the play, what he's doing is trying to persuade his niece Cressida to have it off with Troilus, who he says is very handsome and describes in terms as though he's a bit like Adonis. And when matters between the two lovers are sufficiently progressed, Pandora inquires of Cressida, if my lord get a boy of you, you'll give him to me. So Pandarus is doing exactly what I'm suggesting that honey-sweet Lord Oxford is doing. He is trying to surrogate an heir. He's trying to get Troilus and Cressida together so they can have a boy, and the boy will be given to him. Lord Pandarus, just like Shakespeare according to the sonnets, is disgraced by his actions, and in broaching the Troilus-Cressida affair, his name is tainted. In the play's final scene, Pandarus, like Oxford, is ejected from court, dismissed by Troilus, hence broke her lackey, ignominy, shame, pursue thy life, and live I with thy name. And so the honey-sweet lord, who had hoped to match Troilus and Cressida in order to procure for himself a surrogate heir, balefully ends the play. Thus is the poor agent despised, sweet honey and sweet notes together fail, weep out at Pandar's fall. We seem to have a very close parallel, if we are right, that this persuading, which seems to be going on, the persuading of these two people to get together in order to have this heir, has put ignominy on the faces of poor old Oxford. Now, now it gets really interesting here. If it wasn't interesting already, this is fourth reference to Shakespeare. As I said, there only are really five. I'm actually taking you through all of them, with the exception of Francis Mears' Palladius Tamia. That's the only one in which I do not detect a whiff of scandal. This is fascinating. I really hope that everybody at the back can see this clearly enough. I've got another image that's going to come up just to expand it a bit. Okay, this is Polymantia 1595. If you look it up in Chambers, you're just given the notes down the side, what we call the marginal notes or margins, which run all praiseworthy Lucretia, sweet Shakespeare, eloquent Gaveston, wanton Adonis, Watson's heir. Doesn't really mean much on its own, and that's why nobody's understood it. As many of you will know, there's something I found in there. I'll tell you what it is again in a minute, but there's much more to it than that. First of all, I just want to read to you the main text that is supported by these marginal notes. You have to bear in mind that this is ostensibly a letter from England to the three universities, Oxford, Cambridge, and the Inns of Court. And unless I err, so the I is England, unless I err, a thing easy in such simplicity, deluded by dearly beloved Delia, and fortunately fortunate Cleopatra, Oxford, thou mayst extol thy court-dear verse happy Daniel, whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape was sufficient amongst men to gain pardon of the sin to Rosamond, pity to distressed Cleopatra, and everlasting praise to her loving Delia. Register your children's pedigree in fame's forehead. In fame's forehead. Well, because I've been banging on all this time about this idea of sort of messing around with pedigrees, probably the last line is the one you can most associate with. Whatever's burbling on above it, the final order is register your children's pedigree in fame's forehead. I'm going to try and drill into this to show you exactly what it means. And I've thought long and hard about how to do it, because there's a lot of different stuff here, but what I want to tackle is the end of the sentence first, okay? I want to take it from Daniel, whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape. I think all of you can tell that there's a word game going on there. Whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape. How could it mean anything if it's not a word game? When I first published on this thing, I got it wrong. I've now understood what this means. I did think it was whose sweet refined muse, contract the shape of that, you get who we refuse, which really should be whom we refuse, which I aligned to the eloquent Gaveston. Since I think I was wrong about that, let's not dwell on it. I'm now absolutely certain I've got it right, because it's backed up by everything around it. Daniel, whose sweet, refined muse in contracted shape. Daniel's muse, as we all know, is Delia, yeah? Right, what you've got here, by the way, is 6 works that are openly referred to. You've got 3 by Samuel Daniel, that is to say Delia, the Delia sonnets, the Complaint of Rosamond, and a tragic play called Cleopatra. You've got 1 work by Michael Drayton, which is mentioned in the little note there, Eloquent Gaveston, refers to a poem of his called The Legend of Piers Gaveston. And you've got 2 works by William Shakespeare alluded here. One is Lucretia, and the other is Adonis, wanton Adonis in the side thing there. There's actually a 7th work that is hidden, and this is what we're getting to. Daniel, whose sweet, refined muse in contracted shape, his sweet, refined muse is Delia. Contract the shape of Delia, you get D-L-A. D-L-A, 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 D-L-A. Right, got it. Has anyone heard of the Diella sonnets? Because they are actually very important. They were published in 1596 under the name R.L. They were published in the late 19th century by Grosart, and he guessed wildly about who R.L. was. Interesting enough, Barnfield dedicates a poem to R.L., and that poem also appears in The Passionate Pilgrim. We've got to start looking at these things like Passionate Pilgrim and stop saying, oh, an unscrupulous publisher just grabbed all these poems and shoved them together to get any money by anyone. No, they're themed and there's something going on. I won't have time to talk about Passionate Pilgrim today, but it's full of what we're talking about. Okay, so we're talking about the Diella sonnets, and they're hidden by saying, whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape. So let's get rid of that rubbish, we've worked it out now, and finish the sentence. So the Diella sonnets were sufficient among men to gain pardon to the sin of Rosamond, so Rosamond's been sinned against, and the Diella sonnets are somehow helping against that. Pity to distressed Cleopatra, that's helping to solve the problem of this distress of Cleopatra, and ever-living praise to her loving Delia. I hope you can keep with me, because it is interesting if you just hold with us. Ever-living praise. The ever-living praise goes to the poet, surely, of the Delia sonnets. The name we've got for that poet is R.L. So if I said that the Delia sonnets bring ever-living praise to R.L., that would make obvious total sense to you all. Ever-living praise to her loving, that's very simple because it's the Delia sonnet. So Delia is the object of love, the poet loves Delia, so ever-living praise to her loving. Now it says Delia. Now we're in complete confusion because obviously the poet is the person who's getting the ever-loving praise who loves Delia. Who loves Diella, sorry. Why call the poet of the Diella sonnets Delia? Just doesn't make any sense. But I'm going to explain it to you. First of all, I just want to backtrack and tell you my original thoughts about the Delia sonnets. It was my view that the Delia sonnets were written to the same woman as the Dark Lady in the Shakespeare sonnets. And the reason I came onto this theory was because in 1960, a man called Rogers tried to claim that Sonnet 130 of the Shakespeare sonnets was lampooning the Diella sonnets, satirizing it. Actually, I think he's totally wrong, but he was onto something. What Sonnet 130 is actually doing is rebutting the Diella sonnets. Now, I'll just give you some examples of how the author of the Diella sonnets is praising Diella and how Sonnet 130 of Shakespeare rebuts it. Okay, so the Diella sonnet extols my mistress' snow-white skin. Shakespeare rebuts, but if snow be white, why then her breasts are done. The Diella sonnet says, her hair exceeds gold forced in smallest wire. Shakespeare rebuts, if hairs be wired, black wires grow on her head. Diella says her eyes dart fire more glorious to behold than midday sun. Shakespeare rebuts, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Diella describes her sweet lips of coral hue. Sonnet 130 rebuts, coral is far more red than her lips red. Diella says her sweet breath describes her sweet breath that breathes incomparable sweetness. Shakespeare, Sonnet 130, rebuts. And in some perfumes is there more delight than the breath that from my mistress reeks. Diella sonnets talks of her fair cheeks of purest roses, red and white. Shakespeare 130 rebuts. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. Diella sonnets describes her voice more sweet than famous Tamira's, reviving death with Doric melodies. Shakespeare 130 rebuts. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasant sound. So quite obviously, it seems to me, the object of the Diella sonnets is the same woman as the person who's being told is disgusting by Shakespeare in 130. Now, as we started off this whole talk, we know that Shakespeare and Southampton shared a mistress. So that logically would mean that Southampton must have written the Diella sonnets. Is there anything here to support that rather strange contention? If you look, and I'll come to why the Diella sonnet poet is being described as Delia in a second, but if you look at the marginal notes on the second page, where all that passage about the Diella sonnets is written, you see wanton Adonis, Watson's heir. Now, I don't think it's a great stretch of the imagination for you to know that wanton Adonis is clearly a description of Southampton. We know that he is described as an Adonis, and we know he's pretty wanton. And underneath it, Watson's heir. Well, that seems a rather rich claim, does it not? We don't really know much about Southampton's poems. We think he may have written some poems, but the suggestion is grand enough to be Watson's heir. I mean, Watson's not the most famous poet, he's someone jolly well heard of. Actually, it was as early as I think 1929, that Janet Scott wrote a long thing about the Diella sonnets, and one thing she showed was that the Diella sonnets had borrowed lock, stock and barrel from Thomas Watson's Hecatonthathia of 1582. So the Diella, whoever wrote the Diella sonnets, this R.L., is being described not only as wanton Adonis, but is using Watson as the muse, i.e. Watson's heir. Now, I now want to zoom in a little bit. I'm sorry I'm throwing so much at you, but it is quite interesting to know we've got an identification of some sonnets by Rothelsay here. Right, okay, here we go. Please concentrate if you can, and I really forgive you if it's too much. Can you see from wherever you're standing here a triangle of three names in the middle of this? This is the first page of the Polymantia. At the top, the italicized name Delia. Below it, on either side, Cleopatra, and then Oxford. You see that little triangle? Underneath that, you'll see a base to that triangle, Thy Court, Dear Verse. Now, you may think that I'm slightly inventing this, that I've just seen a triangle because I'm sitting there staring at it being all dizzy and weird. Actually, if you measure the text width here, it comes to exactly 4 inches. If you take precisely the halfway point, that's exactly the 2-inch point, and drew a line straight down the middle, that line would pass through the L of Delia, which is the very central letter of Delia. It would then pass through the semicolon that you see underneath it, which separates Cleopatra and Oxford with a different spacing between it. And then it would pass through the D of Court, Dear Verse. What I'm suggesting here is that the Elizabethans loved text triangles, as we know. I'm sure we've all seen many examples. In fact, they loved putting text into any shape they could think of, into altars or cups or anything. But they particularly loved text triangles. And what I'm suggesting has happened here is that text triangle has been put rather like a brick into the center of a wall, and then it's kind of cemented around it with the surrounding text and the marginal notes. In further support of that, if you actually look at the spacing, you'll see how the and is very crushed up against the Delia there, that the spacing between the end of Cleopatra and the semicolon is much closer than it is to Oxford. So they're deliberately trying to, and not only that, not only is the spacing compromised, but the meaning of the sentence is compromised. So it's obviously been an extremely difficult thing to do. Okay, let's just quickly interpret that triangle. I think most of you know what the base means. We've got Thy Court, Dear Verse, that strange hyphenated epithet there. You can see in it something called a charade, which is when you take a name, keep the letter order, keep the word order. So it's not strictly speaking an anagram. And you see straight away Our de Vere there. The reason Our de Vere is hidden in there is because it's lined up with the margin note Sweet Shakespeare. So it's basically just telling you what we all already know anyway, that Shakespeare's de Vere. So that's not terribly interesting at the moment. But there's another nice little bit of this. Is once you remove Our de Vere from that Court, Dear Verse, the letters left do form an anagram. They form an anagram of A Secret. So you've got Our de Vere, A Secret, supported by the marginal note Sweet Shakespeare. Now, I'm sure you're easily guessing where I'm going with this. We've got those 3 names above, and since you've obviously all guessed it, I'll just tell you what I'm up to. It's pretty obvious. I'm going to identify those 3 as Oxford, Penelope Ridge, and Southampton. The easiest one to dispense with, quite obviously, is Oxford. That's a very simple pun. It's a pun on the University of Oxford and Edward de Vere's title. So that was easy. We've got Oxford. We've got 2 left, Delia and Cleopatra. I've already suggested to you that in this particular instance, we're being told that Delia wrote the Diella sonnets, and that everything points to the fact that Henry Wriothesley wrote the Diella sonnets. By the way, so how can I know that Delia is anything to do with Henry Wriothesley? Look at the side note that's supporting it. All praiseworthy. If any of you were listening when I ran through all those anagrams of Henry Wriothesley, we had praiseworthy, all praise, praise the all praise. So don't get hung up on the fact that there's no P in Wriothesley and there is in all praiseworthy. The fact of the matter is that quite unusual name can be drawn out from all praiseworthy. That's still, however, okay, so we've identified Wriothesley now as Delia, and we know that Wriothesley wrote the Diella sonnets. This is what Covell's told us so far. And we know that the Diella sonnets seem to be very much connected to Shakespeare's sonnets and are talking to Diella, who must be the same person as the Dark Lady. So, why, now this is a little mystery here, why is Southampton represented as Delia? Am I saying that Southampton also wrote the Delia sonnets? You'll be greatly relieved to hear, no, I'm not saying that. The Delia sonnets are written by Samuel Daniel, and we're all aware of that, and we're all happy with that, and I don't have any wish to rock the boat. So why is Southampton connected? Is the suggestion that the woman Delia, to whom all these poems are written, is Southampton? Well, funnily enough, that is half what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the great hunt for Delia was rather a waste of time, because Delia is a reflection. There is no real Delia. Everyone who's been chasing her chasing chimeras. The quasi-similarity of the names Daniel and Delia is no chance. Delia is kind of almost like a reflection, as I keep using that word, of Daniel. Daniel says of the Delia sonnets, these were things uttered to myself. Later he writes of them, I who contented with an humble song made music to myself that pleased me best. The first sonnet of the Delia sequence indicate that Delia's beauty is a mere reflection. And when you read that the image of Delia casts cold water disdain upon the poet's face, we begin to see that what is actually going on here is a very witty set of poems about narcissism, which we've already been talking about. Delia herself, I'm quoting, may view best in my face how cares have tilled deep sorrows. What I'm saying here is that these are joke things about a narcissist, and what people have done and gone, God, they've gone off in the wrong direction. Daniel at that time was living at Wilton with the Countess of Pembroke, which was very near the River Avon, and people have searched that area to find Daniel's love muse. In fact, if you read carefully what he's saying, Avon rich in fame shall have my song where Delia hath her seat. Delia hath her seat because he's on the Avon. He's sitting by the Avon looking at his own reflection. So Delia's seat is on the side of the Avon, you see. So that's the explanation of why Delia is Wriothesley in this particular setup. That leaves Cleopatra. How do we identify Cleopatra with Penelope Rich? You'll also note, in fact, that the side note lines her up with Lucrece there, which is obviously very interesting. But I'll come to that in a second. If you get Daniel's play about Cleopatra, it's a tragedy. And if you read that tragedy, you'll find it's about a woman, Cleopatra, whose name is very, very much blackened due to her immorality. She has had a boy, a baby, out of a wedlock who's a bastard. The first third of that play, she's wailing the fact that she's going to have to give this bastard boy away. Quite obviously, I think anyone can already begin to see that there's a parallel between what I'm talking about if Penelope Rich surrogated an heir to the Earl of Oxford. She's having to give it away, and the parallels with Cleopatra are obviously very high. I know, sour sorts, block your ears please, because I think this is very relevant, some of you won't. In the 1607 edition, we know that Daniel used to keep making his things better all the time. He revised it in 1607, just after Penelope Rich died, and we have this long, terrible wailing by Cleopatra about having to give away her bastard son and never see it again, and she's talking to her son and saying how awful this is, and the very last words she says to her son before he goes away are these: "Well, worthy son, and worthily the son of such a father, and in this thou showest from whence thou came. I say no more, be gone." I can leave you to work that out. Now, Penelope Rich, is she Cleopatra? I've just told you the most horrendous story, and of course I forgot to mention that Cleopatra commits suicide in the end. So we've got the bastard, the wailing, the giving away of the child, the committing of the suicide. Why is she described here as fortunately fortunate Cleopatra? Now, fortunate, obviously, is a synonym of rich. She is being described here as richly rich. I'm not the first person to do that. Lots of poets played around with Penelope Rich's name, calling her fortunate. In fact, Sidney was one of them. If you read John Davis in his Microcosmos of 1603, he dedicates a poem to Penelope Rich, in which he writes, "To descant on thy name, as many do, I should, dear lady, allude unto that which with it compared is. To be rich was to be fortunate. Thou wast much more than unfortunate, though richly well thou play'st that hapless part." So what he's saying is lots of poets have used the word fortunate to play around with Penelope Rich's name. And here we have Cleopatra described as fortunately fortunate. Right, we've now identified our three people involved in this circle once again, as we've seen them popping up in the other allusions: Penelope Rich, Henry Wriothesley, and Edward de Vere. They're here again. Now, what is the relevance of these works that are being described? Am I saying that three works by Samuel Daniel, Delia, Cleopatra, and The Complaint of Rosamond are all somehow thematically linked to Southampton? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, and there is plenty of corroboration of this. If you read a very comic play that came out of Cambridge, by the way, a lot of this stuff comes out of Cambridge. Cambridge is the great enemy of Oxford, so that's why it's all coming from there. If you read a Cambridge play called The Return from Parnassus, you will find, Parce Ros, a figure called Gallio. Since the 1890s, Gallio has been identified as Southampton. And the reason is that both Gallio and Southampton are soldier, scholar, courtiers. Both served in Ireland and at Calais. Both are captains. Both are vain dandies who wear expensive clothes. Are both theatre obsessed and enamoured of Shakespeare. Both associate particularly with Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. Both are mean patrons of poets. Both affect a love of things Italian, though neither has actually visited Italy. So when Gallio walks in quoting a little bit of Shakespeare, and Eudicchio says, "Oh, monstrous theft," he goes on to say next, "I think he will run through a whole book of Samuel Daniels." What he is saying is that Southampton will run as a theme through a whole book of Samuel Daniels. What book could he possibly be talking about? Well, in 1595, a book of Samuel Daniels came out which contained, yes, you guessed it, Delia, Rosamond, and Cleopatra, through which is the theme is run of Henry Wriothesley. So these works are all associated with this great scandal, and I think this is one of the exciting bits of this, because now I can send you, if anyone is interested in this, if you're not rejecting it all in your minds, you can go off and read these works. Let's take, for instance, The Complaint of Rosamond. Here we have the trio that we're talking about, just as we have it in The Rape of Lucrece. We have a persuader, Shakespeare, who's persuading two people to have it off together. The persuader in The Complaint of Rosamond is a honey-tongued matron. Rosamond seems to be Penelope Rich, and funnily enough, I've got a little bit of corroboration for that. Michael Drayton writes, "Fair Rosamond, of all so highly graced, recorded in the lasting book of fame, and in our sainted legendary placed, by him who strives to stellify her name." Well, who stellified Penelope Rich's name is obviously Philip Sidney, who called her Stella. And we have it here in Planer's writing that Stella and Rosamond are the same person. In fact, that same little point is made in one of the poems I glossed over earlier, where Rosamond is described in Barnfield as sweet chaste. And then we get to writing about Lucrece, and we're told that Lucrece is sweet and chaste. Now, either Barnfield is a really pathetically useless poet, that in a very short poem of 4 verses he uses sweet and chaste twice about 2 different people, or he's trying to point out to us that they are in fact the same person. Drayton goes on in that particular poem where he identifies Rosamond as Stella, and he says, Lucrece, of whom proud Rome hath boasted long, lately revived to live another age, and here arrived, here, to tell of Tarquin's wrong, acting her passions on our stately stage. Again, I think that's revealing the pretty obvious thing, that Lucrece is about real people. We're taking a classical story, but we're using it to remark on current people. And Drayton, of course, should know what he's talking about, because Drayton is the author of Eloquent Gaveston. And Eloquent Gaveston is a poem about a prince called Edward, rather like, let's say, Edward de Vere, who becomes very, very besotted with a beautiful young youth who is constantly compared to Adonis, rather like Southampton. This besottedness of Edward's breeds a lot of bad feeling in the court. But Edward is very determined and showers the young Gaveston with lots and lots of gifts, as one might imagine. Happened in the case of Oxford and Southampton, though we can't show that. That one of the things he does is he tries to get the beautiful young, Edward tries to get the beautiful young Gaveston to marry into his family, rather like Oxford, it would seem, was trying to get Southampton to marry into his family. And I think very telling as well is that in this poem, Edward offers titles to the young Gaveston, and one of those titles is, you might have guessed it, Lord Great Chamberlain of England. That happens to be a title that we all know belongs to Oxford. So that's a big hint, saying we're all making jokes at poor old Oxford's expense again. I think I've gone on an awfully long time, but I just have I do have a little climax, so please, if you can bear it, bear with me, because I think it's real nice. Okay, so we've got, I've already mentioned now 7 works, the Delia sonnets, these pieces. I haven't mentioned the 2 Shakespeare. I think for the sake of time, because it's so obvious where I'm going with all this, for the sake of time I'll drop talking about Lucrece and I'll talk a tiny bit about Venus and Adonis. Before I do that, I want you to realise that this scandal that was going on was not confined to these 7 rather beautiful poetic works. There was much lewdness going on outside of it. Very key to this is a work that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is by Marston, called Pygmalion's Image. In Pygmalion's Image, Marston is obviously teasing poor old Shakespeare because he's taken the form and rhyme and pattern of Venus and Adonis, he's taken the idea of an Ovidian theme, and the theme is that Pygmalion makes a statue that he thinks is absolutely beautiful and loves it and falls in love with it, and Pygmalion wants to have a baby by it. But the great problem is pretty obvious what this problem is. It's very difficult to have babies by statues. So what does Pygmalion do? He enlists the help of Venus, and Venus gets him the baby. Now, as if those parallels are not obvious enough between what I've just said, because here's Oxford trying to have a baby with Southampton, and he can't. As he mentions, he's not pricked out properly. And he brings in Venus to sort it out. As if that's not obvious enough, Marston absolutely underlines it. He calls Edward de Vere Labeo, and he calls him Labeo after Quintus Fabius Labeo, who, like Edward de Vere, was a noble poet and playwright of the Roman age who put out plays under the name of Terence in rather the same way as Edward de Vere was putting out plays in the name of Shakespeare. To understand this, you also have to realise that Lynceus, when he says Lynceus, he means lynx-eyed. Marston's talking about himself. He's saying, I've got really good eyes, I'm really perceptive, I can see what's going on. Now, this comes at the very end of the Pygmalion, and look what he says. And in the end of love I wot, Pygmalion hath a jolly boy begot. So Labeo did complain, his love was stone, obdurate, flinty, so relentless none. Labeo, of course, Edward de Vere, he complained that Southampton was stone and flinty, that's a sort of quotation, it is a quotation almost from Adonis. So Labeo did complain that his love was stolen, but Lynceus knows that in the end of this, he wrought as strange a metamorphosis. But that is telling you straight out, it's telling you that Labeo did exactly the same thing as Pygmalion. He did just as strange a metamorphosis, Edward de Vere. We know how he did it. I've just been explaining it to you. So I think that's a rather nice piece of evidence. He's also called Labeo, of course, by Hall, and we've just heard, I'm so excited, I'd love to see it, we've just heard that there is evidence that Hall is actually talking about this bastardy issue. But I, before knowing that, just simply wanted to draw attention to a well-known bit of Hall where he's talking about Labeo, Edward de Vere, and he's saying, long as the crafty cuttle lieth sure in the black cloud of his thick vomiture, who list complain of wronged faithful fame when he may shift it to another's name? So in other words, he's saying that Labeo, Oxford, is washing his dirty linen, if you like, in public, but getting away with it because he's hiding behind a false name. In fact, it is Robert Prechter, I think, was talking very interestingly today, comparing it to the Ovidian Tristia, the sort of repenting his life in his works. And so I'm going to round this up very briefly now by just simply talking about Venus and Adonis. I'm sorry it's gone on, but this I think is lovely, and it does end it, and we've got to touch on Venus and Adonis. Okay, so Venus and Adonis is about the scandal. Yes, oh God, you're getting bored, I can tell, but please listen to this because I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. I think you'll be very interested. Venus and Adonis, title page. We have on the title page Venus and Adonis. I've got a picture of it here. Yes, I have. Up there in the headpiece, you have the head of Juno. Juno, of course, is the goddess of fertility. Underneath that, you've got a Latin inscription, which tells you pretty well what I'm saying is going on. Vilia miretur vulgus, he's saying, let the crowd, let the others, let the vulgar people enjoy vulgar things. In other words, let the gossipers do their gossip. I am going to be inspired by Apollo and put this into a beautiful poem. He's telling you right there that he's going to write a poem about something that a lot of vulgar people are gossiping about. So, as I say, I think we know what that is. You then turn the page and you get to Southampton's dedication, and lo and behold, blow me over with a feather, what do we hear? Southampton is described as noble godfather to the first heir of my invention. Well, it's pretty obvious what the first heir of his invention. Oxford's invented an heir by this strange contrivance, and he's calling Southampton the godfather of it. Well, why is he the godfather? Of course, because it's a secret, and God knows, God only knows, who the natural father of this heir is. And then, of course, you get little signs of talking about the barren land and the rich harvest. So lots of little hints about pregnancy there. And he ends, I leave your honour to your heart's content, which I wish may always answer your one wish, and the world's hopeful expectation. It makes me slightly think that Penelope Rich is actually pregnant at this stage, this expectation. This was first put in the Stationer's Register just barely 2 months before 18th Earl of Oxford was born. Okay, very, very, very quickly, okay? We all know what the story is of Venus and Adonis. We have Venus, I've already explained to you that she's obviously Penelope Rich. We have Adonis, we don't need explaining why he's Southampton. Adonis is persuaded to procreate, there's a lot of that going on just like in the sonnets. And there's a very odd little scene where Venus falls backwards and pretends to be unconscious, and Adonis gets on top of her and kisses her, and she's only pretending to be asleep. I'm completely guessing and speculating, you can laugh at this, but it may have some sort of connection to what actually happened. There may have been one of them pretending to be asleep in bed when another one came in, but that's pure guesswork. Let's quickly move on. At the end of Venus and Adonis, Adonis goes off hunting. Now, the third character is the boar. Now, it's not a coincidence, in my view, that the boar happens to be the cognizance, the thing of the family of Oxford. Not only that, if you count the number of times the boar is mentioned, it comes to 17. So 17 boar, it's obviously the Earl of Oxford. The third person is the Earl of Oxford, represented as the boar. What does the boar do? He takes on the role, in all these other poems, of the persuader, if you like. He goads Adonis in the groin, which is in the area of his genitals, let's say. Organs of generation, I should say. And the blood coming out of there grows up from the ground as a meleagris flower. And in the very last bit of it, Venus picks that flower, she takes it to her breast, and she rocks it and she cradles it, just as though it's a baby. So if I'm right, if it's a baby, and all this that I've been telling you isn't pure fantasy, this baby flower, symbol of the baby, should be symbolizing the 18th Earl of Oxford. Well, is it? Now, in all the previous myths about Venus and Adonis, this flower is an anemone. Shakespeare is unique. He chooses a purple and white checked flower, which is called a meleagris. Why does he choose the meleagris, and what has it got to do with the great saga I've been crashing on about? Well, I'll tell you the answer to that. The meleagris in England is an extremely rare flower. However, it grows in great profusion to this very day in Oxford, particularly in the Magdalen Meadows, and is known as the iconic flower of Oxford to this day. 2, if you look in Gerard's Herbal of 1597, and you look up this meleagris, you'll know that it was also known as the Narcissus lily. Hence, it's linked now to Oxford, and it's also linked to Southampton Adonis through being called the Narcissus lily. Now, what about Penelope? Why is it called the meleagris flower? The reason it's called the meleagris flower is because its speckles are thought to look exactly like the same speckles on the meleagris bird. What then is the meleagris bird? Can I please refer you to Cooper's Thesaurus Linguae of 1578, where you can look up meleagris, where you'll get the following definition. Birds that we call hens of Guinea or turkey hens, also called Penelopes. This stems from Pliny, who wrote about them as Penelopes, and there's a lovely little couplet from Haywood in Britain's Troy, where he writes, "Circles with birds of meleagris race, their melting hearts against their duties strive. They take young Arnea from the sea and call her of those birds Penelope." So the meleagris is a synonym of Penelope. So you've got the 3 in that beautiful little symbol that takes you to the rather more clumsy symbol that I showed you right at the beginning of the 3 girlands. It's the same idea of those 3 wrapped up. My very, very, very last sentence, you'll be pleased to hear. I can tell that I may have cut across the grain of a lot of things that a lot of people think. I just throw it out to you because I think there's a lot that's interesting here. And if you do choose to pursue it or look into more, I hope it will help you with an answer to an awful lot of questions, not least, why did Shakespeare not be connected to the Earl of Oxford after Oxford's death? Very simple answer. The Earl of Southampton lived until 1624. The Earl of Oxford, 18th Earl, lived until 1624. And Penelope's legitimate children became very powerful in government and obviously wanted to keep the name Shakespeare away from the name De Vere for as long as possible. And that is my last sentence. Thank you very much.